And good afternoon, everyone. We're delighted to see so many people attend this event. We had about 180 register for the event, including a number outside the UK, and also 90 institutions with about 80 from the UK. So we're pleased that this has been a very topical event. So if my colleague could sort of start the slideshow, we'll work our way through that. Yeah, thanks very much. So maybe the next slide, please. So we're very pleased today to sort of introduce to you the document that was prepared by two of our executive committee members, which is published in February. And really our vision for this is to provide a resource for colleagues to discuss and to identify appropriate institutional responses to this particular challenge. So really it's aimed as a reference point, and we hope that today's discussion will really help inform your own considerations within your own institution going forward. And one of the things that we would like to think about as the council is to offer a service whereby we sort of curate institutional responses. So perhaps at the end of this webinar, there will be an opportunity for Owen and colleagues to just remind us of how we can engage in that activity. So the next slide, please. So today we have four members of the executive committee ready to present and to discuss. So I'm Douglas Halliday from Durham University, and until July, the chair of the executive committee. Perhaps I could ask my colleagues to introduce themselves. Gill? You're muted, Gill, I think.
Hi everyone, I'm Gill Houston. I'm vice chair as well until July only, like Douglas. We're falling off our perches at that point.
Yeah, thanks very much. Doug?
Hi everybody, yeah, I'm Doug, not Douglas. Doug Cleaver from Sheffield Hallam University. I'm director of the doctoral school, but I've also been co-chair of a number of sessions for a director of doctoral school through UKCGE over the last year or so.
Janet.
Hi everybody, I'm Janet Dewalder and I'm director of the Queen Mary Academy at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm a UKCGE executive committee member. Pleased to be here, thank you.
Great, thanks very much. So we'll be hearing from all our panelists later on during today's webinar. So if we could move on, if you move forward 2 slides, please. I don't think we need that one. Okay, thanks very much. So what I want to do is just to really go through the way that the guidance is structured to help us engage with it and to begin to think about how we might ask questions and discuss its value and usefulness to the sector. So in producing a document like this, I think the starting point is that we need to recognize is that each individual institution as a legally recognized body with its own research degree awarding powers is ultimately responsible for the standards of the awards made in its name. So that sort of sets a sort of context within which we think and we operate. So clearly it is not the council's role to set out a list of responses. It's our role to really inform debate and discussion and to enable each institution to consider and reflect for itself what the most appropriate response is. So that's the sort of introductory framework. And within the document, there is a very brief discussion on how the degree awarding process works, how it's benchmarked, the role of sector bodies, for example, QAA, in assuring quality both nationally and internationally, which of course is important. The next section of the document, which is one of the sections that Gill played a very important role in writing and developing, is what examiners look for, and we will discuss a little bit more about that later on. So really, that's the sort of starting point for the question. If you are appointing your own examiners, you need to be clear that both you and the examiners have the same understanding of what it is they are required to look for in making a threshold judgment about the validity of any awards they are recommending to your institution for approval. We have a section summarising the range of impacts that COVID has had on the doctoral process, and I'm sure we're all very familiar with that now in terms of disruption to research, lack of access to laboratories, difficulty in doing field work, difficulty in accessing archives, working at home, carer responsibilities, full-time, part-time, and so on. So, you know, there has been a wide-ranging and broad spectrum of impact, and we felt it was important to explicitly acknowledge that in the document, not just for ourselves, but also for any doctoral candidates that wish to engage with this, because I think it's important that they also have confidence that we are fully cognizant of the impact it's had on them, and we're able to articulate that. We then have a section which looks at the implications in terms of what is presented in the thesis, in terms of the volume and the range of research activities. And then we move on and look at the impacts on the doctoral examination process. And again, my colleagues on the panel will be making more detailed comments about that shortly. And then the main section for institutions to consider is section 6. So the approach we decided to take was really to frame our sort of advice and guidance to institutions as a list of questions for institutions to consider. And it's grouped into different categories at the institutional level, at the examiner level, at the supervisory team level, and also importantly at the candidate level. So there's a wide range of questions posed in this document where we hope that upon reflection in your institution, when you're thinking about your own responses to these questions, that you will come up with your own contextualized response, which is the most appropriate response for your candidates at your institution, you know, given the diversity of institutions we have represented here today. So we felt that that was really important in helping you to get to being able to make decisions and respond to this. And then the final section is about the opportunity to share good practice. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So I think when writing this document, you know, there were a number of sort of important key messages that I wanted really to come through. And the first I've already mentioned, that ultimately, although this is a national, well, even an international problem, the sort of individual response falls at the door of those with institutional autonomy. So responsibility for standards does lie with each of you within your own institutions. But of course, collectively as a sector, I think it's very helpful for us to think about some kind of collective response that perhaps in the fullness of time, if that's appropriate, and depending on what that response is, we might find ways of articulating that to other stakeholders who have an interest and a sort of a concern in this area possibly. I think the other message is that based on some of the work and findings that we will hear about shortly, the evidence available to us through the literature and through the expertise of colleagues on the executive committee is that examiners take their role very seriously, and that, you know, academic standards are well defined, they are robust, and so that's the sort of starting point for our discussion. And then I think moving on, number 3 on this slide, it's very clear that we must consider some level of mitigation. I think that is appropriate, and I think it can be done in a way that does not sacrifice the integrity of the doctorate or the doctoral examination process. You know, the pandemic has affected every aspect of, well, not just university and education, but all aspects of life. And, you know, I think we need to learn collectively how we respond and how we adapt in some coherent and meaningful way to this particular challenge. So there are a number of significant implications, both in terms of the volume of work, the range of research that's presented, the methodologies that candidates may or may not be able to use, access to data sets, whether candidates have had to sort of reframe and rescope their projects. With many of the candidates I've worked at Durham here, we've run a Plan B workshop with some of them in our doctoral training centres, really getting them to think about how they can begin to engage with this process whilst undertaking their PhD. So there is a wide range of ways in which this can be responded to, and that's really important. And part of the function of this document, it's not just to get you to think about the doctoral examination process, which of course is the end point of possibly 3-4 years or even longer, 6-7 years part-time work. It's important to begin to think about the framing of those responses now, as early as possible. And then finally, it's about informing the development of effective responses in institutions. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. So there are a whole range of issues that we really would like to consider, and that's what today's workshop is about. So, having set the scene, what I'm going to do is very shortly is to invite colleagues on the panel to make some comments, and then we will open it up for comment and discussion, because we're very interested to get a sense of the views from across the sector on your thinking about this approach, and indeed whether or not within your own institutions you've begun to, well, I know some of you have begun to develop your own responses to that. So that's really what we want to hear about today. So the first bullet point is something that I spent a bit of time thinking about, and that's what I refer to as disciplinary norms. I'm a physicist, so I know what a PhD, at least the 20 or so that I've examined, looks like in physics, and that sort of sets a sort of an expectation. But of course the challenging question then is, how does that disciplinary norm or expectation or experience, which of course examiners draw on experience, how does that relate to what the institution is actually asking an examiner to undertake? And you'll see a number of questions along that line. So for me, I think this is one area where we could think about, guidance or support or discussion in terms of, what kind of response we could have. And that links to the bullet point there about assessment criteria. What are your institutional regulations? What do they say about the institutional requirements as a legal document for the academic standards of the award, and how might those be interpreted in ways that sort of support and enable in the current context? And also, the issue of independent chairs, which has been around in the sector for many, many years. And, many institutions have independent chairs routinely, others don't. Some have them only under predefined circumstances. So there is an opportunity here maybe to think about the doctoral examination process itself and how it's structured and organised. So at that point, I'm going to pause and I'm going to invite Gill to make some comments based on her contributions to the document. So Gill, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Douglas. As you've said, we're aware that institutions have slightly different approaches to how they've advised candidates to raise issues with examiners about how the pandemic may have affected their research. And I'm sure there are also disciplinary considerations, as Douglas has mentioned. I found this is a quotation from one university's guidance, which is pretty much all-encompassing. I know that some institutions have decided not to allow candidates to mention any issues caused by the pandemic in their thesis. However, this one says, it may be necessary for research students to include a statement in their dissertation on the impact of disruptions on their work. Examiners will consider this statement in relation to the scope and volume, two things already mentioned, of the research student's work, but will always uphold the requirements for the award of research degrees. And I think that's pretty clear. And the council's position is very much in alignment with that second clause there. As we put it in the statement, no diminution of quality in doctoral theses, both to protect the integrity of the candidate's research and prevent any suggestion that the achievements of those graduating with a doctorate since the inception of the pandemic have somehow produced inferior work. And we consider that particularly important. But of course, we don't want to have any idea that we would be telling institutions what to do. In the document, we have acknowledged that access to data, as has been mentioned, is likely to have affected all candidates, irrespective of their discipline, to a greater or lesser extent. And we mention ways in which access challenges might be mentioned. Of course, supervisors have a fundamental role in advising candidates on how they can practically address issues arising from the pandemic that have affected their research. And they can also help with developing the resilience that's part of showing you're capable of conducting research independently. This brings us to the question of what examiners are seeking. We have here 4th and 5th bullet point. Now, what I found with my own research was that there was a continuum of judgment that characterises examiners' approach to the final examination. They take account of the attributes displayed in the thesis. Clearly, that's the principal site of their decision making. And the obvious one being originality or a contribution to knowledge, as well as publishability, research competence, including the ability to make an argument using data and to situate the knowledge in the wider field. I'm sure everybody's familiar with these. Now, some of those qualities are also exhibited and developed in the viva, together with a range of professional and personal characteristics. So while the thesis is the principal source of evidence, the viva fulfills an important moderating role. And perhaps in current circumstances, it becomes even more significant in enabling candidates to explain any adjustments they've had to make to their research to accommodate pandemic-related issues while maintaining the quality of output. And that's really challenging. My study demonstrated that the viva assumes much greater significance if or when examiners are concerned about the quality of the thesis. And it's therefore important that online vivas provide such candidates with equal opportunities to fully defend their research as would be possible in a face-to-face situation. And we've covered that in another of our documents on the website. And I want to conclude before Janet and Doug have a chance to say something by talking about the approach of examiners. Now, this is so important that they maintain some flexibility, that they come to the viva having read the thesis in a constructive way. And in our guidance, we've emphasised that examiners should limit their expectations to what is reasonable for a candidate to have achieved in the circumstances. Some candidates will exhibit particular resilience, while others will have struggled, even while succeeding. And this reflects the perennial range of achievement above the assessment threshold that Douglas mentioned. Examiners are used to this and expect it, but at present they need to be particularly sensitive to the challenges candidates have experienced in getting to the point of submission. Okay, over to you, Janet, for your comments on this.
Thank you, Gill. I've been asked to comment on how doctoral candidates have adapted to the virtual viva and the challenges and advantages of this. First, I want to recognise that each doctoral candidate's experience and adaptive capacity is different. Where candidates are working from home, their home conditions for their online viva will vary. The room space available, the number of people they share with, the number of dependents they have, And furthermore, the quality of their devices and their broadband, this all differs. Some may worry about their internet connections, and others might have difficulty to find a quiet space. And so these are things they might be worrying about. We should also note that the past year has been extremely challenging in terms of mental health, and any assessment is a point of stress. Furthermore, candidates have had reduced interactions with other researchers and their research environment. And particularly while you're waiting for the viva, that used to be support from other peers around was very, very encouraging. So each person, and hence each doctoral candidate, has their own personal COVID story and how this has impacted on the viva assessment. And we should remember it is a very personal narrative. For some, the arrangements for vivas have actually been easier. At Queen Mary, the central team have noted that vivas have been arranged much more quickly than pre-COVID. I'm speaking in general there, but I acknowledge that it might not have been true for everybody. And it depends where the candidates are. Some candidates may be overseas, and also in relation to where the examiners are. I'd like to comment on the exam time. Some of our students were wondering whether their vivas would have been longer in person, and wondered if they were examined to the same extent. So some people were expecting a 3-hour viva and had an hour and a half viva. Well, started to worry about that. But 3 hours in person doesn't always translate to 3 hours online, and we've all experienced that a solid 3 hours online is much more exhausting than 3 hours in person. And obviously each institution will have a required break time. But I'm just reflecting some comments that our students have made about that. On a difficult side is that I call it micro interactions, where the body language and all those clues that we pick up are kind of a bit lost online. So their experience during the viva is maybe more of a challenge. And then you have all sort of the ground rules in muting mics, unmuting mics, silences at the end of answers, and all of that to help the candidates. The sort of ground rules at the beginning is really, really helpful. And I've been noticing that on the Twitter feeds and the PhD chat and things, people are saying surround yourself with flowers, put cups of tea out. So the candidate can, if possible, create a very positive environment around the screen. And that's maybe something you couldn't have face to face. And then the big one is at the end of the viva, and that macro social interaction of going for a meal or a celebration afterwards. And some have reported a lack of a sense of closure after the viva, that they came off MS Teams or Zoom or whatever, and then that was it. And that was a really sense of the closure wasn't the same as it may have been in person. So I think they're the main points I wanted to make, that it's really different for each candidate, and we have to be really aware of, as my colleagues have been saying here, of each situation and that ability to adapt. Overall, we've been really very impressed with how our students have adapted. It's been very positive, but it's not the same for every, those experiences will depend on their personal circumstances. And we have to remember it's a point of assessment, and that is a stress. So thank you very much, and I'll hand over to Doug, I think. Yeah.
Thanks, Janet. So I've been asked to consider this document in respect to the examiner perspective, because all the changes that we brought in last March, April were quite rightly focused on the needs of the candidates, giving them an equitable and fair assessment. The needs of the examiners were rather sidelined, I think, but actually it's essential that the examiners have all the tools that they need in order to perform their duties correctly and adequately. And if they're not feeling comfortable with the process, then that will have potential negative consequences. There are a few things that we brought in. There's this issue of enhancing the independent chair role or recording the viva. Different institutions went their own way, or went different ways on that. There's a genuine mix of those two things going on across the country. An aspect that rather brought in was a bit of a digital divide in terms of examiners. I had some very experienced examiners who were not confident to use the tools that we're now using. It's an additional duty for an examiner, potentially, particularly in the recorded case. And people were very reticent to take that on. I don't know if you work much with the research councils, but now they're very conscious of cognitive overload over assessors and on research council panels. That's a huge issue for an examiner as well, and saying, oh, you've got to do it all online and monitor all these other things. You know, at the moment I'm looking at the chat and the list of speakers. That's not really what you want to be doing when you're being an assessor, and that's a real issue. Another thing was a hard copy of theses. Trying to look at an electronic copy of a thesis in a Viva is a really tricky thing to do. So we've got our print unit to dish those out to examiners, because a large part of the assessment, as Gill's research said, is looking at the thesis properly, and I scribble all over the things, and that's part of my process of immersing myself in the thesis. And if I can't do that because it's online, then that's then affecting me as an examiner, and therefore affecting the Viva, and that's ain't good. So the bit I really love about Gill and Douglas's document is question 17. What are the expectations on the examiners? If there's going to be an additional statement or an additional something, then what's the examiner to do with that? What are the examiners to do with that? How should that impact on them? What is the appropriate response? We expect examiners to be sympathetic and listening and interested in the way the research has been conducted and how COVID has impacted. But how should that affect their judgment and their final assessment? Have to be absolutely explicit criteria set. Otherwise, you're going to get divergence and unfairnesses. I think an aspect that is likely to have to come in, though, is in terms of the recommended modifications. There are going to be some modifications which would have been absolutely fine a while ago, but now, because you can't go off and do more field work or go back in the lab and redo results, there are going to be some things which just are not reasonable, which would have been previously, and that's all likely to be coming across the board. And finally, I was reiterating what Janet said about lack of closure. If you've done an online Viva, it's different from the 20 odd you've done before. Examiners have been in lots of Vivas before. They probably know what they should be expecting, and it's different for them. Most candidates only ever go through one Viva, so there's no baseline to change things from. We've had quite a lot of engagement with update training or update sessions from examiners and potential chairs. People want to know what the shape of the Viva is going to be, and at the very least laying lots of that on and nudging people to say it ain't going to be the same as the face-to-face ones that you might have done. I've done 24 face-to-face and a couple of onlines, and the onlines were really tricky things to do, and the lack of closure at the end was very difficult. Having been in a really fun, engaging Viva, and then click on the red leave button and go downstairs and have a cup of tea. That was quite a cliff edge to fall off as an examiner. Mm-hmm. But it was not about me; it was about the candidate. Right, hand back to Douglas, and we can have some nice chat.
Okay, thanks very much, Doug. So you've heard from our panelists. Just a couple more things I would like to say just before we open it up for comments, questions and discussion. Picking up on what Doug has just said, I think it's really important to begin to think now about messages to candidates who are partway or beginning their PhDs, because my experience at my institution is that candidates are already beginning to think about what will the end point be for them because of this situation. So I think messages of reassurance would be very welcome for candidates now. There's no need to put the slides back up, colleagues, but the very final bullet point on the last slide that we were showing effectively was saying what will be the legacy of how we as a sector, or how you as institutional representatives handle this. And I think that's very important, because I think, if we get our approach and messaging correct at this stage, then I think we can move forward with confidence. And, it is my hope and belief that, there is more than enough capacity in the sector to build on what we know is a robust examination process, as we've heard, and think about how we can take it forward. So at that point, I'm going to stop and say thank you very much for your attention. And so if you've got any comments or questions, you're very welcome to put them into the chat. If you would like to have a verbal sort of interaction or verbal comment, please raise your hand, and we will endeavour to monitor those. And when you're invited to speak, you're very welcome to unmute and interact with us that way. So thanks very much. So it's over to you now. And I can see that we've already had a couple of comments in the chat. Doug touched on this, but there's a sort of comment here from Elizabeth Hulton about the advantages of independent chairs versus audio recordings of vivas in this context. And I can see that Joanne has just popped in what are other universities' approach to recording vivas. So, okay, Tony, you've got your hand up first, I think. Would you like to comment on that or ask a question? Tony Armstrong.
Hello, yeah, thank you. I'd like to ask a question, please. Is there any research or experience related to vivas that have a performative element? And I'm thinking about candidates who are using arts-based research methodologies. For example, one of my students has an installation as part of their doctorate, and hasn't had access to that installation because it's actually inside the institution. So I wondered if there was any reflections on vivas where there's a strong arts-based type performative element.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think I'm going to invite Gill to comment on that first. I think she would know most of the panel members on that. Gill?
Well, thank you very much. I think this is a very difficult question. It's your particular example, Tony, was about an installation that might be within the institution that the candidate cannot and the examiners cannot visit. Is that correct?
Well, that was an example, but there are others, I'm sure.
Well, firstly, I'd say that I think everybody is getting better at making spaces safe. And I would have thought that at the moment it would be possible to allow somebody to perhaps video an installation that the examiners could have. If it's the candidate's work, presumably they can talk about it independently, but it's of course critical that the examiners can see what they've done. If it's art, I think recording and videoing are possible options in this case. Of course, you don't want to put the candidate off. You don't want them to have a long period before they can have the result of their examination. So I think using technology in these circumstances can be very, very useful. But I'm going to ask other people who are attending, our delegates, if they have managed any performing arts examinations during the COVID period. Could somebody put their hand up if they have, or say something?
Yeah, Alex, we'll come to you in a minute. Keep your hand up. But, colleagues, has anyone had any experience of professional practice based yet? Roberta?
Yeah, actually, I supervise all practices research PhDs, and I've examined them too during this period. And there's a wide range of possibilities available. So one of my students who's a painter is actually sending boxes of paintings to her examiners this week. And one of my students who is a performance maker is doing performance on Zoom and asking the examiners to take into account that they're using a different form and format for that. So every single one has a different outcome, but there are many, many opportunities and possibilities as long as all the examiners understand that these are unusual circumstances and creative responses to them.
Great, thanks very much, Roberta. Yeah, I mean, I think the general point emerging for me in this discussion is the fact that we need to think about how we make the evidence available to the examiners to allow them to be informed about the decision we're asking them to make. So normally that would be through the thesis and the viva. But of course, in performance and practice-based doctorates, it could involve, some kind of artifact, some kind of performance. So I think what I've heard is institutions thinking about ways that they could make those available to the examiners. And then, of course, that raises the question about, what is a doctoral examination in terms of an event? Is it a single event? Is it a sequence of events spaced out over a period of time? And it seems to me that, institutions should have the flexibility to allow for, examiners to review material in advance of interacting with the candidate, if that's the most appropriate response. So I think, that's a really important piece of information there. Just before we move on, Janet or Doug, did you have any comments you wanted to make on that topic?
Queen Mary, we have hosted a very small number of face-to-face vivas, or where there was a need because of the project or something in the candidate circumstance. We push things on a case-by-case basis through the necessary health and safety regulations. I think that flexibility is necessary. We can't require everyone to do online vivas if it's really not appropriate for one reason or another.
Yeah, thanks. Janet, did you have a comment you wanted to make?
It's just the same as Doug's, really. It's about flexibility per candidate and seeking solutions and being very flexible. Exactly the same as what Doug's institution's doing. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I can see a comment from Roberta Mock, where she says the practice is, in capitals, part of the thesis in many cases. So I think that's correct. So, I think we assess a coherent piece of work as a whole, which has different components. And, forgive me if my scientific language maybe wasn't up to the task there. Alex Lamont from Gill, you've had your hand up for quite some time. Would you like to speak to us now? Thanks.
Yes, thanks very much. I've got a few points now, actually, as the conversation's moved on, but I'll start where I started. I was just going to say, it's great to see these guidelines. I think some institutions were ahead of you, actually. So there is some guidance that's been circulating, which I hope you've seen. I think Nottingham were particularly helpful in being an early version of actual guidance for examiners. And we're part of Midlands Innovation Group, so we had the opportunity to share some of those things quite early on. But it's great to see this, and it really, really helps, I think, to have this at a national level, to have a clear set of things to think about. I just wanted, my first point was going to be to really support this point about the role of the independent chair. We've had independent chairs at my institution for as long as I can remember. It was something that was introduced at least 15 years ago, if not earlier. And it makes every single aspect of the in-person viva go more smoothly. And having moved to online, I have to say, it is an absolute godsend. My experience with teaching is always, if you've got someone else in the room that's not responsible for the delivery of the session, it makes everything feel more relaxed. And that is that role of the person as an independent chair in a viva takes the pressure, as Doug was saying, off the examiners to have to worry about any of the technical issues, any of the management of the session. And so I would be encouraging colleagues to introduce that if it's not something you already do. And I was going to say, we were also a little ahead of the curve in terms of e-submission of theses, which we had introduced prior to COVID. We're getting, examiners are able to request a paper copy if they really want one. But we're getting very few requests like that these days. So we've kind of found that the practice has moved on and people are more used to reading enormous documents. You take a different process to note taking than you would if you were reading a piece of paper. But I think it's one of those things where the sector just is beginning to move on, and this one of the positive outcomes here is that we're able to do things differently. And in response to Alex Hinchcliffe's question, we already had e-theses, we will be keeping them. We're going to keep online vivas as an option because we've realised that it expands the range of potential examiners. And coming from a place in the UK which is not that easy to reach physically, it's very, very great news for us to be able to draw on people who may be able to spare an afternoon but wouldn't be able to spare a day and a night or even a couple of days. So I think there's a lot of positive things coming out there too.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much. And before we move on to our next question, I mean, there's a really interesting issue there about the sort of prevalence of independent chairs for vivas. And, you know, many institutions have different approaches. At my institution, Durham, the norm would be to put in place an independent chair where it was felt that the examination team that was appointed didn't necessarily have sufficient experience or expertise in terms of being an experienced examiners team. But, you know, many institutions have different approaches, and I can see in the chat that some institutions are both having independent chairs and recording. So, I mean, just before we move on from the issue of independent chairs, I don't know if any colleagues on the panel or anyone in the meetings got any sort of comments they wanted to add about independent chairs.
Well, I'm a really strong advocate for independent chairs. They gave us well, we had them already. We enhanced the role as part of our COVID assessment changes. But the extent of reassurance that they were able to give to candidates pre-viva was really, really valuable through last summer. And then word spread and anxiety levels dropped off really well. We've never recorded vivas. Who would own it is a big question. What purpose would it ever be used for? And the fact that people we got research that shows that people behave differently when they know they're being recorded. So I'm behaving differently because I know the session is being recorded. It's just a fact, and the half-life of that is about the length of the typical viva. So,
yeah, thanks, Doug. Jill, you wanted to make some comments on this, I think, and then Elizabeth.
Thank you, Douglas. I'll be really quick. It seems very interesting that some institutions favour independent chairs, which I fully support, and others favour recording. And certainly many years ago, when I think somebody said they'd had independent chairs for 15 years, which I find really brilliant. I think it was Alex, possibly. Institutions themselves can have reasons for not wanting to do that, concerning taking up staff time and finding people in cognate disciplines who know enough to sit in. And other people would argue, well, you don't really need to because you're not part of the exam, but you're there in case people need various things that we all know about, or to be reminded about institutional regulations. When I did my research, 5 of the 10 cases I observed had independent chairs, and on 2 occasions they were particularly useful. And I just wanted to say, I think now, as we've said in our other document, it's absolutely critical. And I know that some people record because they don't think they have the person power to have an independent chair for every viva. Thanks, Douglas.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Elizabeth from UCL, I think you've got your hand up. Phil, I think your hand predates this discussion. I'll come to you next, but Elizabeth, yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, my comment follows on quite directly from Jill's, just that I was really curious. I mean, we have been asking that people record the vivas whilst they're doing the vivas remotely, and we had done that as an exception during the pandemic because we were just concerned about what would happen when you're on your own. And of course, it's gone remarkably smoothly and well, and we haven't had any problems. But we are now just trying to consider whether this is something that we should keep going forward. And I was quite interested in the concept of having recording of vivas to combat inappropriate behaviour. or bullying in vivas, which I have had increasingly reported to me. And I was just curious, my concern with an independent chair was if you happen to have someone quite junior, they might feel very, put upon or in an awkward position, or not, wanting to get in between something like that. And in that sense, I felt that a recording might be more objective support in that regard. And I was just wondering if anyone had any experience with that I could share.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I mean, while colleagues are thinking, if you want to respond to Elizabeth, please put your hand up. But I mean, let me just respond initially and say, we have very clear criteria for what we expect of examiners in terms of their understanding of the field, in terms of their breadth of experience, in terms of previous experience, in terms of research activity and so on. It seems to me, given the importance of the role of independent chair, this would be an opportunity to think about having reasonably clear criteria that set out, the expectations and, if you like, the person specification for independent chairs, so that the dynamic in the viva is such that it is very clear, who the independent chair is, why they are there, and that they are able, because of virtue of who they are, to conduct what's expected of them very clearly. And that to me seems one way in which you could think about some of the issues you've raised. I mean, I can see some comments in the chat. Vida from Middlesex has trained independent chairs and so on, and some institutions can offer further support for independent chairs and so on. So I think there are quite a lot of examples out there of how to use independent chairs. And I feel I would also like to sort of just say something about the comment you made about inappropriate behaviour in vivas. And of course, one can't say with certainty, but certainly the evidence that's available to me is that poor experience in the viva is becoming much less common and much less frequent. And I would say that's a positive thing. And I think part of what we can do here is send out clear messages that, what the expectations of examiners in vivas are. I mean, I don't know if any colleagues on the panel, Gill, Janet or Doug, want to make any comments in addition to that?
Yeah, certainly. So I train the independent chairs at my institution, and part of that is to set an expectation that they will intervene if need be, and if they're either lack the experience or the confidence to do that, then the chair isn't the thing for them to be doing. But then the examination statistics, the outcomes of vivas improved once we introduced chairs a few years ago under guidance from someone called Gill. In terms of staff time, I think they more than pay for themselves. If you get a few resubmissions, then
yeah, okay, great, thanks.
Thanks. Very quickly, I would say that when independent chairs were used in the vivas I went to, they had been brilliantly trained and briefed exactly in the way that you described, Douglas. And I wonder if everybody is sufficiently interested, we could easily give some examples of those. I have a couple myself. If people think it would be helpful, we could put something up on the website about that. How to behave.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jill. Well, I think that's something we should think about after this meeting, so thanks for that. Simon, did you want to comment on this issue, or have you got a separate question? You want to carry on then, Simon, please.
Yeah, thanks very much. We discussed your document actually only on Friday in Research Degrees Committee, and very interesting it was. So this is I mean, I'm not going to sort of dwell on independent chairs versus not independent chairs, but I think actually, just to diverge and to actually address your document specifically, we did think that either the independent chair, or where we don't have an independent chair, the internal examiner, is particularly useful in the viva at briefing the examiners and the student on the expectations that the institution might have on a reduced scope thesis, for example. It's quite difficult for an institution. I mean, we have a standard paragraph that we send out to examiners, which talks about various possibilities in it, but it says ultimately it's your judgment that counts in terms of what you expect as evidence to meet the threshold standards. So we are preparing some guidance, which is probably based on your document, probably quite brief guidance for either the independent chair or the internal examiner, which will sort of ask those questions. So, well, it will put something more than that. But I think drawing specifically on the QAA, two things that the QAA have said, that it's quality of research, not volume. And the other one is the ability for students to be able to adapt their projects. And those two things we've highlighted in the statement to examiners, and maybe we'll flesh it out for internal examiners. I mean, the problem we have is that obviously vivas are ad hoc in the sense that they go on all the time, and we have around 400 examinations a year. So that's our challenge in terms of training. And obviously we don't know who the examiners are going to be quite until reasonably close to the examination period. So I just thought I'd share that with you.
Great, thanks very much, Simon. Thank you. I feel I should invite Phil to speak now. He's had his hand up for a very long time, so apologies, Phil, but the screen is now yours, so over to you.
Yeah, so I guess my question was about this whole idea of a thesis of equal quality. It's always been a little bit ill-defined what is a high-quality thesis or what is over the bar anyway. But if we get a situation where we see students who've, for example, tried many things during their thesis, but actually haven't got complete results, which might be either because it's intrinsic in the subject, you know, those ones requiring large amounts of field work would have been problematic, but also those who are just who've just had very serious personal impacts. I'm just struggling to see how the equal quality bar is going to allow us to move forward with something which is at all equitable. So I guess my question is you know, are we expecting to see a very significant increase in the number of failures, and should we be happy with that, or how much should we be happy with that?
Okay, thanks very much, Phil. I mean, I think that's a really important question. And I mean, it may be that that's the last sort of substantive question we can take at this meeting, given the time we have. But you're absolutely right. And, you know, it is a challenge. And this is the question that I think we need to address directly and explicitly. And, you know, obviously it will vary from discipline to discipline. You know, there is part of an argument that says, you know, part of the function of the PhD is the process, not just the end point. You know, so we are also assessing individuals with a range of competencies that they are building up to demonstrate the skills, attribute, and knowledge of independent researchers that would be recognized as such. And, you know, so part of the experience of undertaking a PhD is the process itself. You know, there are challenges, yes, if you're undertaking the kind of PhD project where you rely on sort of results or findings to be an integral part of the evidence that is presented in your discipline, then I think part of the answer to your question has to be addressed not at the examination stage, but at the sort of project rescoping stage, where there should be a dialogue between candidate and supervisory team, thinking about, you know, how can we be confident that at the end of this process, this candidate will have sufficient evidence that is available, being undertaken in a reasonable amount of time. I mean, I'm pleased Simon, in a sense, touched on the QAA advice, which was published after the UKCGE advice, was partly for a different audience, but I think, you know, very much is complementary and supplements what we were saying. And I think, you know, they made some very useful additions here. So it's about, you know, what is reasonable to expect from the candidate in the circumstances in the time available. So I think I will pause there and first of all see if any of our panel members have anything they want to add before I come to the delegates. Gill?
I've got some quick points to make.
Yeah, please.
which build on your comment, Douglas, about the process. And I think what I've observed is that examiners, of course, they're looking at the thesis, but they're looking at the person and their potential. And I think that remains important. I don't think there are any easy answers. I think there will be some people who, because of their discipline, will come off better and others will come off worse. For example, I know somebody that has had terrible interruption to their experiments because each one takes 3 months in the lab. And things like that are going to be challenging. I think it also puts even more responsibility on the supervisors to try and help candidates restructure or whatever. I agree, it's not just at the end. And I also think it's not simply a current problem, that this is going to be something that will affect doctoral candidates for a while. So we need to get used to thinking about how to help people, but I don't think it's insurmountable.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. Janet or Doug, do you have anything you want to add?
Just support what Jill was saying about the and talking about the scope of it, having that time with the supervisor to adapt the scope and also consider what extensions are available from the university. And we have 2 different types of extensions available, so to build up that evidence. So yeah, it's that responsibility of that conversation between the supervisor and the candidate about what can be achieved in the time available and with the extensions available.
Yeah, thanks very much. Doug?
I'd say that generally the assessment processes are working remarkably well, partly because of what Janet was saying about having the flowers, having the comfortable space. Candidates are doing possibly even better in their own space than they were with traditional vivas. In terms of Phil's point, I think we haven't come across the really tricky cases yet, the really damaged projects, and people or candidates whose individual circumstances really got in the way. We're looking out for it, and we're trying to introduce what flexibilities we can in order to support those candidates.
Yes, yeah, thanks very much. And I mean, just finally to say before I wrap up, I think that would echo with my sort of anecdotal evidence that's available to me, that, you know, I'm not hearing any significant evidence of substantial changes in the outcomes of doctoral examinations on average across institutions. And I also agree with Doug. I think, you know, we're not yet at the point where we're going to see the sort of maximum impact coming through. And, you know, that has to be part of the debate about whether or not candidates qualify for extensions or some kind of funded support. And I think, you know, that mitigation, you know, is part, I mean, it's a different dimension, but I think it's part of considering the totality of the experience of candidates from induction through to passing their viva. So, colleagues, it's 2 p.m. We need to draw this meeting to a close. So thank you very much for what has been a really interesting and stimulating discussion. We have made a recording of this event, which we will endeavour to put up on the UKCGE website as soon as possible. The slides, there weren't many, but they will be made available. The document will be made available. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Owen and sort of ask if he's got any comments he wants to make about how the council plans to sort of share and or make good practice available. And there was Jill's comment also about making guidance for independent chairs. So, Owen, I think I'll leave to you.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you everyone for your time. As you know, the council exists to support you and in supporting postgraduate provision at this time. So please do get in touch with me or any of us at the council if you require any further assistance or you want us to run another discussion on a subject. I mean, for me, the key issue here was on independent chairs and what we can do to support guidance, offer examples of what's happening there. I take Alex Lamont's point at Keele that there are existing guidances out there now at the institutional level on what to do with the impact of COVID on doctoral assessment. If you think it's helpful for the council to collect some of those together and produce a web page on that, please do get in touch. We're more than happy to put a sort of central database together on what different institutions are saying or advising candidates if you think that would be helpful. So please do get in touch with us, and we will scour the chat of this meeting and make sure that that there are further comments in there that if they need acting on, we will do so. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, well, thank you very much, colleagues, both my fellow panelists and to all of you for making the time to attend. It just remains for me to wish you all a good afternoon and continued success with your support for doctoral candidates, because that's really what it's all about. So thank you very much, everyone, and good afternoon.